Hey everyone, it's Mr. Hefner again, and today I'm coming to you from one of my favorite places, the Gettysburg battlefield. It's absolutely gorgeous here. It's just about sunset, as you can see. Where's the sun? Right there is the sun, and it's an absolutely beautiful place. We're looking west right now towards the mountains that lead to Chambersburg, and obviously I'm not really here because it was the nice people at the American Battlefield Trust who provided this background image. But it seems to be a perfect one here. A number of years ago, I took a group of students to the Gettysburg battlefield, and one of the students among the group was not very happy about being on the trip to a battlefield. And when we got back from the day, one of the questions I had was, what is something you learned about the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg, about the novel? We were studying Michael Sherr's The Killer Angels at the time. And the answer she put down to that question is one that stayed with me for a very long time. She said, I learned that horrible things can happen in very beautiful places. And certainly the Gettysburg battlefield, horrible things happened here. Over the three-day battle in 1863, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, it still remains today the bloodiest battle in all of American history, with 51,000 casualties on this battlefield in a three-day period. And yet it's still a beautiful place today. And so I thought this was a pretty good introduction to our poet today, the first poet that we have in our modern era unit, Carl Sandburg. The poem we're going to do today by Sandburg is a very simple one. It's very short, and we'll actually do it as part of this video. But it's called Grass, just G-R-A-S-S. And it borrows on some ideas that have already been introduced in this class before. If you can remember back to our New England Renaissance unit, some of you presented on a poem by William Cullen Bryant, which was called Thanatopsis. And one of the ideas in that poem was the idea that we always exist, even when we die and leave this world. We simply become part of the world again. That, it's that idea of the law of conservation of mass, if you want to do it as a student of physics. And then in our Civil War unit, we read Walt Whitman. We did two poems by Walt Whitman, and the second one was Song of Myself. And the idea in that poem, again, was that, when we die, our bodies break down and we become the soil, and the soil becomes grass. And Carl Sandburg is going to pick up on that idea. Now, Carl Sandburg's poetry is very kind of like user-friendly. Some people refer to Carl Sandburg as America's poet. And this is one of these poems that people can relate to. It's got a clear theme, sort of a dark side to it, a dark message, but there's nothing difficult about reading the poem. And I could see that his work would reach many, many people. So let me introduce you to Carl Sandburg. And then as part of this video, we'll go through the poem, and then we'll finish up with the check for understanding questions. So let's get started. All right, so here you have the lesson topic today. It's going to be the poem called Grass, and it's by the poet Carl Sandburg. Our unit essential question today is going to be, how does grass represent the style of Carl Sandburg? Now, you can go through a bunch of different poems by Carl Sandburg, and they're going to have some different styles. And in addition to being a poet, he was also a well-known biographer. He wrote a very famous biography of Abraham Lincoln. So we can't really define his style with a single poem, but what I would like you to look for is I used the word accessibility a moment ago. Look for how the poem is simple, it's readable, it doesn't use flowery language, and yet it conveys a very powerful message. So let's take a look at what we need to look at for Carl Sandburg here. All right, so if you were in class and we were doing this presentation live, I usually put up the Reader's Journal questions so we can at least use them to discuss. And it says, have you ever visited a historical site where a famous person lived, a battle was fought, or a treaty was signed? And how's the site different now? What emotions does it evoke? And this is the reason why, here in my video, I'm standing on the Gettysburg battlefield. Because when you go to Gettysburg, and I hope you've been there, and if you haven't, it's 80 minutes away from Robisonia. I certainly hope you will go there sometime and take a tour and get out of the car, walk, feel the ground under your feet. Certainly, what happened there, if I use Abraham Lincoln's words at the Gettysburg Address, he said, those who struggled here have hallowed this ground far more than our poor power to add or detract. It's a very special place. And if you don't know what happened there, you can just go and say, oh, it looks like big fields. Then there are signs and there are statues up. But when you know the story of what happened there, it affects you differently. But my point is this: if you don't know the story of what happened there didn't happen there, essentially. You just ride by in your car and you see some grass fields, and that's it. And suddenly the 51,000 casualties mean nothing because you can't see that. And yet the place goes on. The story is over, but the place goes on. And it can be very beautiful, even though something terrible happened there. And you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to the poem in just a second. Here's a photograph that I took. So instead of stealing the one here from the Battlefield Trust people, here's a photograph that I took from the top of Little Round Top. Little Round Top was assaulted by the Confederates, who were, if I use my, yeah, here we go. So I don't know how well that yellow highlighter shows up there, but the woods across the field there is where the Confederate soldiers were. And over the course of time, their attempt was to come this direction here and attack the hill that we're standing on right now. It was very costly, cost a human life. And then even those people who survived, many of them lost limbs and lived the rest of their lives without the use of an arm or a leg or their vision or something like that. But you can see that, even in this picture taken with a cell phone camera, it's a beautiful place today. All right, there's Carl Sandburg. He's born in 1878, so he's born just 2 years after America celebrates its 100th birthday. And he lives until 1967. So Carl Sandburg is still alive when this guy right here is 5 years old. So our authors have reached into our time period pretty well. And the background image that I've used here, you might recognize it, is one of the cemetery fields at Normandy. World War II, where the Allied troops tried to assault the beaches. Now, Sandburg was the son of an immigrant blacksmith, so he's a first-generation born American, and blacksmithing was a very reputable job. It was good labor. You worked for yourself. You might remember Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Blacksmith, from a few units ago. But this is not a guy who's going to go to the world's finest universities and get the best education. This is a guy who's going to educate himself for the most part. And that this might be why we call him the poet of the common people, or America's poet, because he wrote in a language and about topics that reached everyone. They weren't always these lofty subjects that required, great study. He did lots of things. He was a journalist, which means, he wrote for newspapers and things like that for a while. He was a folk singer, and he wrote his own songs. So he wrote folk songs, he sang his songs, and he was a biographer, as I mentioned, and his biography of Lincoln is still considered one of the most complete and best respected biographies of Lincoln even to this day. He fought in the Spanish-American War, and war changes everybody who fights in a war. And he developed a very strong anti-war sentiment, the idea that we're too quick to fight wars, and that certain people profit from wars while other people go off and fight the wars. There's an old expression, goes back to the Civil War, about the Civil War, says, rich man's war, poor man's fight. And Carl Sandburg was one of the people who believed exactly that. This man received 3 Pulitzer Prizes. So not that we're having a contest here, but as we go through this unit, we'll look at the number of Pulitzer Prizes that different authors received. 3 of them, if I remember right, 2 were for his poetry, and then the third one was for his biography of Abraham Lincoln. He only had an 8th grade education. So I said he didn't go to Harvard or Yale or Dartmouth or anything like that. 8th grade education, and he gets 3 Pulitzer Prizes for his writing. So this is somebody who certainly was a self-made man. All right, as far as this selection goes then. So like I said, Sandburg was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, but your textbook says he hated warfare. I don't know of many people who live through war and like war. It's one of those things where, it's not a likable kind of thing. And this poem, Grass, is going to take the idea that when people die in wars, we bury them. And sometimes the places we bury them become beautiful spots later on. Trees grow, the grass grows, nature takes over again. And years later, sometimes, like Gettysburg, people just drive through and say, what beautiful countryside this is. And they don't know what happened up until that point. Now, Carl Sandburg is going to be somebody who also lived through World War I, the war to end all wars before World War II came along. And I think I mentioned before in class that while during our American Civil War, which was Americans fighting Americans for 4 years, we didn't see 1 million deaths. We did not see 1 million deaths. And yet in World War I, some battles saw 1 million casualties. All right, so it was far, far more costly here. And in this particular poem, there are going to be references to several battles. Some of them go all the way back to the time of Napoleon. Gettysburg is mentioned in here, and some battlefields from World War I. Now, the literary tools for this piece, there's parallelism, which we've talked about a number of times. Parallelism is when an author expresses more than one idea, but uses the same grammatical form to express them. Sometimes it creates a nice rhythm, but more importantly, it creates an expectation in the reader of what is going to happen next. We saw parallelism all the way back with the Declaration of Independence. We saw it with the Gettysburg Address, and it gets used in speeches a lot, but it's going to be in this poem, so we can look for that. And then the other thing we're going to look for is personification. And in this case, the grass is the speaker in the poem. So remember, in a short story or a novel, we have a narrator. In a poem, what seems like the narrator, we call the speaker. And the speaker is going to be the grass that grows in these places that were once battlefields, or that are cemeteries even. All right, so here's the poem. Now, I'm going to do my best job to read this poem to you, and this is the whole poem. Starts here with pile, and it ends with the little black square down here. But in Schoology, I've put a link to Carl Sandburg reading this poem himself. So we haven't had this to this point. We haven't had recordings of authors reading their own poems. And in this unit, we're gonna have quite a few of these. And I urge you to go to that folder in Schoology and listen to the poem, because the way Sandburg reads it is almost chilling. All right, but here's the poem. And the poem goes like this. Pile the bodies high at Austerlitz and Waterloo. Shovel them under and let me work. I am the grass, I cover all. And pile them high at Gettysburg, and pile them high at Ypres and Verdun. Shovel them under and let me work. 2 years, 10 years, and passengers asked the conductor, what is this? Where are we now? I am the grass, let me work. All right, and that's the poem, and it's pretty dark. The idea, again, of human beings going off to war, killing one another in great numbers, burying the bodies. But what is the job of the grass? What is the job of nature? To grow over it and make things as if it never happened again. And so, Gettysburg is an American Civil War battlefield. Ypres and Verdun are both World War I battlefields. We have Waterloo, obviously during the Napoleonic Wars, where Napoleon was defeated. I'm not sure about Austerlitz, but I think it's probably from the Napoleonic Wars as well. And years go by, and the grass has just taken over. And as people ride a train, they wouldn't have been driving by in their cars at the time this was written, but as people ride by in the train, they ask the conductor of the train, and the conductor kind of takes care of the passengers and checks tickets and things like that. What is this place? See, they've already forgotten. The dead have been buried and the grass has done its work. It's grown over top and it's made people forget. Where is this place? And the grass says, I'm the grass, let me work. As if nature's job is to undo every horrible thing that we've done. All right, so I can't do this in a video, but if we were live, I would click that little link at the bottom and we would watch. It comes up here, but if I click it, you will not hear the audio. But this is the video that I put in Schoology. And if you go there and you click play, you will hear Carl Sandburg reading the poem himself. And I really do encourage you to do that. All right, so these are our checking for understanding questions. They're not multiple choice, they're not true or false, but you should be able to answer all of these. How is the personification used in the poem? And you would discuss things like the speaker in the poem is in fact the grass. That's personification by itself. I've never heard grass actually speak. And not only is the grass speaking, but the grass is very task-oriented. The grass is like, I've got to do my work. Let me alone. I've got to do my work. I've got to cover up these dead, pile them high, and I will do my job, and I will make this place beautiful, and everyone will forget what happened here. And the phrase that's repeated is pretty obvious. I am the grass, let me work. We hear that several times, and I've already answered who's the speaker in the poem. It's the grass. And the speaker's attitude towards the bodies is really one of indifference. The speaker is, in this poem, the grass, which is the speaker, isn't sad that people have died. It's not horrified that people have died. In fact, it just says, pile them high. Let me do my work. Just let me alone and let me do my work. All right, so that's a very short lesson on Carl Sandburg. Again, if you haven't done so, go into Schoology and find Sandburg's own reading of that poem. You really ought to hear it in his voice. Also check Schoology, see if there's anything else that you need to do along with today's lesson. But that's it for today. I thank you for staying with me to the end, and I'll see you next time.